The Apostate Messiah and the Phantom of Zion, a comprehensive analysis of Jacob Frank, the Frankist movement, and the paradox of Israel. Introduction, the heresy at the heart of modernity. The history of the Jewish people in the 18th century is dominated by a figure of such profound contradiction and radicalism that his legacy continues to fracture historical narratives and theological certainties to this day. Jacob Frank, 1726–1791, born Jacob Lejbowitz in the borderlands of Podolia, was not merely a heretic in the conventional sense, he was the architect of a theological nihilism that sought to dismantle the very foundations of rabbinic Judaism from within. Emerging from the smoldering embers of the Sabbatian movement, the messianic fervor ignited by Sabbatai Zevi in the 17th century, Frankism represented a mutation of Jewish messianism that was at once anarchic, militaristic, and profoundly assimilationist. The relationship between Frankism and Israel is a subject of immense complexity, characterized by a dualistic tension that sits at the core of this report. On a theological and geographical level, Jacob Frank vehemently rejected the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. In a radical departure from millennia of Jewish yearning for Zion, Frank declared that the true destination of the Jewish people was not Jerusalem, but Edom, a typological cipher for Christian Europe, and specifically Poland. He viewed the traditional hope for a return to Palestine as a sterile endeavor, commanding his followers to find their redemption in the abyss of European society rather than the ruins of the temple. Yet, paradoxically, the shadow of Frankism looms large over the historiography of the modern state of Israel and the ideological origins of Zionism. This connection was forged primarily by the great historian of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, who famously argued that the dialectic of history transformed the destructive energies of Frankist antinomianism into the constructive forces of the Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, and, ultimately, secular Zionism. In Scholem's reading, the Frankists were the unwitting midwives of Jewish modernity, shattering the ghetto walls through their apostasy and paving the way for a nationalism that no longer relied on divine intervention. Conversely, in the darker realms of historical revisionism and conspiracy theory, the Frankist movement is cast as a sinister, clandestine ancestor of the Zionist project, an allegation that relies on the movement's history of secrecy and infiltration. This report offers an exhaustive examination of Jacob Frank, the theology of his sect, and its intricate, paradoxical relationship with the concept of Israel. By synthesizing primary accounts, theological treatises, and centuries of scholarly debate, we will explore how a movement that marched toward Edom may have inadvertently cleared the path to Jerusalem, and how its redemption through sin continues to echo in the modern Jewish experience. 2. The Sabbatian Matrix, the prehistory of the Frankist eruption. To understand the phenomenon of Jacob Frank, one must first excavate the soil from which he grew, the crisis of Sabbatianism. The declaration of Sabbatai Zevi as the Messiah in 1648, followed by his shocking conversion to Islam in 1666, created a theological trauma of unprecedented magnitude in the Jewish world. While the majority of Jews reacted with despair and eventually returned to normative observance, a persistent minority refused to accept that the redemption had failed. These believers, Ma'aminim, developed a theology to explain their Messiah's apostasy. Just as the high priest must enter the Holy of Holies, the Messiah must descend into the lowest depths of impurity, the clippet husks of evil, to rescue the divine sparks trapped therein. 2.1 The survival of the sects. By the time Jacob Frank was born in 1726, Sabbatianism had evolved into a clandestine underground network. In the Ottoman Empire, the Donma converts practiced Islam publicly while maintaining their own syncretic rituals and belief in Sabbatai Zevi's divinity. In Poland and the Ukraine, however, the movement remained technically Jewish, hidden behind a facade of intense piety or disguised within the emerging Hasidic movement. This created a volatile atmosphere of suspicion and heresy hunting. The Podolia region, where Frank was born, was a heterodox province, on the periphery of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a place where rabbinic authority was weak and mystical speculation was rampant. It was here that the radical Sabbatian sect of Baruchia Russo, Osman Baba, gained influence. Russo, a leader of the radical Donma wing, taught that the new Torah of the Messianic age entailed the violation of the Old Torah's prohibitions, including those regarding sexual morality. Jacob Frank would later claim to be the reincarnation of both Sabbatai Zevi and Baruchia Russo, completing the Trinitarian progression of the Messianic soul. 2.2 The socio-economic context of rebellion. The rise of Frankism cannot be divorced from the material conditions of 18th-century Polish Jewry. The community was reeling from the aftershocks of the Chmielnicki massacres, 1648, and the breakdown of the Council of Four Lands, the central organ of Jewish autonomy. The Frankist movement drew its strength not from the established rabbinic elite, but from the uneducated, the poor, and the marginalized who felt abandoned by the rigid structures of the Kahila community governance. For these individuals, Frank's message of overthrowing the scholars and the Talmud was not just theological, it was a socio-political liberation theology. 3. The Rise of Jacob Frank, Biography of an Anarchist. Jacob Frank's life was a picaresque journey through the religions and empires of the 18th century. Born Jacob Lejbowitz, he acquired the nickname Frank during his travels in the Ottoman Empire, a term used by Ashkenazi Jews to denote a Sephardic or Eastern Jew. This linguistic marker highlights his perpetual otherness. He was a Frank in Poland and an Ashkenazi in Turkey, an outsider in every context. 3.1 The Making of a Messiah. Frank spent his formative years in Wallachia and Bucharest, immersed in the Sephardic Sabbatian culture of the Balkans. He worked as a merchant, dealing in gems and textiles, a trade that allowed him to move between communities and absorb the radical doctrines of the Dhamma. Unlike the scholar mystics of the earlier Sabbatian phase, like Nathan of Gaza, Frank was uneducated in the traditional sense. He was a bore ignoramus by rabbinic standards, often boasting of his ignorance of the Talmud. His charisma derived not from textual exegesis but from raw, primal authority and a talent for storytelling and myth-making. In 1755, Frank returned to Poland, not as a merchant, but as a messianic claimant sent by the Dhamma leadership in Salonika to reveal the hidden faith to the Ashkenazim. His arrival catalyzed the latent Sabbatian circles in Podolia. He declared himself the Holy Lord, and began to preach a doctrine that went far beyond the quietism of the earlier believers. 3.2 The Lankoran Incident, the exposure of the cult. The turning point for the movement came in January 1756 in the town of Lankoran. Frank and a group of his followers were discovered conducting a secret ritual behind locked doors. When local Jews and authorities broke in, they reportedly found the sectarians dancing around a half-naked woman identified in some sources as the wife of a rabbi or a symbol of the Shekhinah, and engaging in orgiastic acts. This event, known as the Lankoran Scandal, confirmed the worst fears of the rabbinic establishment. It was physical proof that the Sabbatian heresy had mutated into something aggressively antinomian. The participants were arrested, though Frank himself, claiming status as a Turkish subject, was released and expelled to Ottoman territory. The incident triggered a massive rabbinic investigation, leading to the pronouncement of a harem excommunication at the Synod of Brody in 1756. This ban was absolute. It forbade any interaction with the sectarians, labeled their children as bastards mamzerim, and effectively declared war on the movement. 3.3 The strategic pivot to Edom. Isolated by the Jewish community, Frank made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the movement and Jewish history. He directed his followers to seek the protection of the Catholic Church. This was not a simple conversion of convenience but a theological fulfillment of his doctrine. If the Messiah, Sabbatai Zevi, had entered the external shell of Islam to liberate the sparks, Frank reasoned that he and his followers must enter the external shell of Christianity, specifically, the Catholicism of Poland, which he identified with Edom. Frank presented his sect to Bishop Dembowski of Kamieniec Podolski as Zoharists, or Contra-Talmudists. He argued that they, like Christians, rejected the Talmud as a book of lies and blasphemy. They claimed to believe in the Zohar interpreted through a Trinitarian lens and a God that was triune. This alignment seduced the Catholic hierarchy, who saw in the Frankists a potential instrument for the mass conversion of the Jews. IV. The Theology of Nihilism, Redemption through Sin. To comprehend the Frankist rejection of Israel and their eventual embrace of Catholicism, one must delve into the radical theology articulated in the words of the Lord Slowapansky, a collection of Frank's sayings recorded by his disciples in Polish. This text serves as the gospel of Frankism and reveals a worldview of profound Gnostic duality and nihilism. 4.1 The Doctrine of the V and the Descent. Frankism was built on the concept of the descent into the abyss. Frank taught that the road to the true God, whom he called the Big Brother, or the good God, was blocked by the laws and religions of the world, which were created by lesser, malevolent powers often associated with the God of the Old Testament or the creators of the Talmud. To reach the good God, one had to break every vessel and transgress every boundary. This movement was symbolized by the letter V, a descent into the deepest darkness followed by an ascent to the highest light. I did not come to raise you up, Frank told his followers, but to cast you down to the bottom of the abyss. For one cannot rise until one has descended to the very bottom. This is the essence of redemption through sin, Mitzvah ha vera, the violation of the Torah is the only way to fulfill its true spiritual intent. 4.2 The rejection of abstract Judaism. Scholars like Pavel Masiejko and Rachel Elior have highlighted Frank's intense disdain for the abstraction of rabbinic Judaism. The rabbis, Frank argued, lived in a world of words and legal fictions, divorced from the raw reality of life. Frankism, by contrast, sought, the thing, das Ding, a concrete, palpable experience of the divine. This necessitated a rejection of the dead laws of halakha in favor of a living connection to the leader, who embodied the law in his own person. This theology explains the sexual antinomianism of the sect. If the laws of sexual prohibition were created by the false god, or the rabbis to keep humanity enslaved, then engaging in forbidden sexual acts including incest and adultery, which were rumored practiced, was a liberating act of spiritual warfare. 4.3 The gender revolution, the maiden and the Jivira. A unique feature of Frankist theology, extensively analyzed by Rachel Elior and Ada Rapoport Albert, was its elevation of the feminine. Building on Kabbalistic concepts of the Shekhinah, the feminine presence of God, Frank claimed that the redemption would be ushered in by a woman. He referred to this figure as the maiden, or the virgin. This theological principle manifested in the veneration of Frank's daughter, Eva Frank. Upon Jacob's death, Eva assumed leadership of the sect, becoming the Holy Mistress, Jivira, or the incarnation of the Shekhinah. For the Frankists, the Virgin was not the Virgin Mary of Christianity, though they used the image outwardly, but a messianic figure within the Godhead. This radical egalitarianism, where women took active roles in ritual and leadership, was anathema to both the Jewish and Christian establishments of the time. Table 1. Comparative theology of messianic movements. Concept Traditional Lurianic Kabbalah, Sabbatianism, Sabbatai Zevi, Frankism, Jacob Frank. Messiah, Human King, Future Redeemer. Sabbatai Zevi, First Redeemer. Jacob Frank, Final Redeemer, God Incarnate. Torah, Eternal, Immutable Divine Law. Valid, but strange actions, permitted for Messiah. Torah of Atzilut. The old law must be destroyed. Sin, violation of divine will. A mystical necessity for the Messiah only. Redemption through sin. A holy duty for all believers. Geography Eretz Israel, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, spiritual center, exile is temporary. Poland, Edom, rejection of Jerusalem. Gentiles, separation, Havdalah. Interaction to gather sparks. Assimilation, mimicry. Walking to Esau. The paradox of Zion. Frankism's anti-Zionist geography. The user's query specifically links Frankist and Israel. It is crucial to delineate exactly what Israel meant to Jacob Frank. While modern conspiracy theories conflate Frankism with Zionism, the historical reality is that Frankism was explicitly anti-Zionist in its geographic and theological orientation. 5.1 Inches Walking to Esau, the displacement of Zion. Traditional Jewish messianism is centripetal. It pulls everything toward the center, Jerusalem. Frankism was centrifugal. It pushed outward toward Europe. Frank based this on a re-reading of Genesis 33, where Jacob promises to visit Esau in Seir but never does. Frank declared, "We must go to Esau," which he interpreted as a command to enter the heart of Christian Europe. In the words of the Lord, Frank states clearly, Jerusalem is destroyed and will not be rebuilt. In Poland, all goodness is hidden. He viewed the Holy Land as a barren, accursed place from which the Shekhinah had fled. The divine presence had migrated to the north. Therefore, the Jews' stubborn attachment to Eretz Israel was, in Frank's view, an idolatrous error that prevented the true redemption. 5.2 Poland as the new promised land. Frank identified Poland not just as a temporary waystation, but as the land of life. He appropriated the language of the promised land and applied it to the Vistula. This was a radical territorialism that anticipated later non-Zionist Jewish movements that sought homelands in Europe or elsewhere. By declaring Poland to be the site of redemption, Frank offered a theological solution to the agony of exile. The exile is the home, provided one transforms it through the new faith. This stance creates a sharp distinction between Frankism and modern Zionism. Zionism is predicated on the negation of the diaspora, Shlilat ha-Galut, the idea that Jewish life in Europe is untenable. Frankism was predicated on the negation of Jerusalem, the idea that the Middle East is irrelevant to the Jewish destiny. The Great Betrayal, the Disputations and the Blood Libel. The rupture between Frankism and the Jewish people was sealed through a series of public spectacles orchestrated by Frank and the Catholic Church. These events are critical for understanding why Frankism became viewed as a satanic force in collective Jewish memory. 6.1 The Kamianic Disputation, 1757. Under the protection of Bishop Dembowski, the Frankists challenged the rabbis to a public debate. The Frankists presented a series of theses, claiming that the Zohar taught the doctrine of the Trinity and that the Talmud was full of errors and blasphemies against God. The rabbis, hamstrung by the fact that the Frankists were supported by the Church, were forced to defend the Talmud without offending Christianity, an impossible task. The result was a foregone conclusion. The bishop ruled in favor of the Frankists and ordered the confiscation and burning of the Talmud. In late 1757, thousands of volumes of the Talmud were dragged through the streets of Kamianiec Podolski and burned in a public square, a catastrophic event for Polish Jewry. 6.2 The Lwów Disputation, 1759, and the Blood Libel. If the burning of the Talmud was an assault on Jewish literature, the Lwów Disputation was an assault on Jewish life. Encouraged by the Church, the Frankists added a seventh thesis to their arguments: the Talmud teaches that Jews need Christian blood, and whoever believes in the Talmud is bound to use it. This was the first time in history that a group of Jews or former Jews had validated the blood libel, a lie that had caused the torture and execution of countless Jews across Europe. The rabbinic delegation, led by the Baal Shem Tov according to legend, and prominent rabbis like Chaim HaKohen Rapaport, fought desperately to refute this. While the church authorities were not entirely convinced by the Frankist proofs regarding the blood libel, the mere accusation by insiders provided antisemitism with a lethal weapon for generations. 6.3 The Mass Conversion. Following the disputations, the Frankists had burned their bridges. In late 1759, a mass baptism ceremony was held in Lwów. Approximately 3,000 Frankists converted to Catholicism. Frank himself was baptized with great pomp in Warsaw, with King Augustus III of Poland serving as his godfather. However, the conversion was a sham. Frankists continued to marry only among themselves, referred to Frank as the Lord, and held their own services. The Church soon realized it had not gained 3,000 Catholics but had imported a 3,000-strong heretical sect into its midst. Frank was arrested in 1760 on suspicion of heresy and imprisoned in the fortress monastery of Czestochowa. 7. The Court at Offenbach. The State, in miniature. After 13 years of imprisonment, during which he was mythologized as a suffering martyr, Frank was released by the conquering Russian armies in 1773. He spent the final years of his life in Brno and then Offenbach am Main, Germany, where he established a court that functioned as a sovereign state in miniature. 7.1 The Sociology of the Sect. At Offenbach, Frank lived like a prince. He maintained a private militia of hussars, dressed in uniforms of his own design. Pilgrims from Poland traveled to Offenbach, bringing gold and silver to support the Lord. The court was a hotbed of intrigue, ritual, and military drills. Frank referred to his followers as a camp, Mahane, emphasizing the militaristic nature of his messianism. This period is crucial because it demonstrates the territorial aspect of Frankism. Frank did not seek integration into the German Jewish community, he sought sovereignty. He petitioned the Austrian Emperor Joseph II for a land grant to establish a territory for his people, envisioning a Frankist autonomous zone. Though this plan failed, the Offenbach court represented a state within a state, foreshadowing the political autonomy sought by later Jewish nationalists. 7.2 The Succession of Eva Frank. Upon Jacob's death in 1791, his daughter Eva took control. Under her reign, the sect became even more mystical. She was known as the Holy Mistress, and was rumored to be the illegitimate daughter of the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, a myth propagated by the sect to enhance her status. The financial burden of the court eventually led to its collapse, and Eva died in debt in 1816. However, the Frankist families did not disappear, they integrated into the upper echelons of Warsaw and Prague society, carrying their secret heritage with them. 8. The Sholem Thesis. Frankism is the hidden root of Zionism. We now turn to the most significant intellectual bridge between Frankism and Israel, the historiography of Gershom Scholem. In his seminal essay, Redemption Through Sin, 1936, Scholem proposed a theory that shocked the Jewish world, that the Frankists, these traitors, and nihilists, were actually the subconscious architects of Jewish secularism and Zionism. 8.1 The Dialectical Necessity of Evil. Scholem argued that rabbinic Judaism in the ghetto had become frozen and rigid. It required a volcanic explosion to shatter the walls and allow something new to emerge. Sabbatianism and Frankism were that explosion. By destroying the authority of the rabbis and the sanctity of the halakha, the Frankists liberated the Jewish individual from the shackles of tradition. Scholem wrote, "The crisis of the Sabbatian movement. paved the way for the Haskalah and the reform movement of the 19th century. He believed that the energy Frankism directed toward holy sin was eventually sublimated into secular politics. The Frankist desire to overturn the world became the Zionist desire to build a state. 8.2 The neutralization of Messianism. Scholem posited that Zionism was a form of neutralized Messianism. The Frankists had tried to bring the Messiah through magic and sin. Zionism tried to bring the redemption, sovereignty, through politics and labor. Scholem saw a direct line of continuity. The Frankists broke the religious taboos, making it possible for later Jews to think of themselves as a nation, rather than a religious congregation. This theory was deeply personal for Scholem, a Zionist himself. He needed to find a usable past for Zionism that was not merely a return to Rabbinic Judaism. By claiming the heretics as ancestors, Scholem legitimized the secular revolt of Zionism as an authentic expression of Jewish history. 8.3 The counter-arguments, Masiejko and Idol. Modern scholars have challenged Scholem's thesis. Pavel Masiejko argues that the link between Frankism and the Haskalah is very weak, and that Scholem constructed a grand narrative to serve his own ideological needs. Masiejko points out that Frankism was authoritarian and cultic, whereas the Haskalah was rationalist and liberal. Moshe Idol argues that external factors, antisemitism, European nationalism, were far more important for the rise of Zionism than internal mystical heresies. Idol suggests that Scholem overemphasized the influence of Sabbatianism to create a purely internal Jewish history. X. Conspiracy theories. The Frankist state of Israel. While Scholem sought to link Frankism to Zionism as a historical dialectic, conspiracy theorists have linked them as a diabolical plot. In the fringes of political discourse, Frankism has become a code word for a secret Jewish cabal controlling the world. 9.1 The Antelman Thesis. Marvin Antelman, in his book To Eliminate the Opiate, argues that Jacob Frank formed an alliance with Adam Weishaupt, founder of the Illuminati, and the Rothschild family to destroy all religions. According to this theory, the Frankists infiltrated the reform and conservative movements and eventually founded Zionism to create a secular, anti-religious state in Israel. Antelman claims that figures like Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, a Zionist leader, were secret Frankists working to undermine traditional Judaism. He cites the Frankist use of redemption through sin to explain modern secularism and moral decay. 9.2 Deconstructing the conspiracy. While Antelman's theories are rejected by serious historians, they exploit real historical grains of truth. Genealogy. It is true that prominent Zionist figures, including Louis Brandeis, were descendants of Frankist families, the Wellies of Prague. Brandeis's mother kept a picture of Eva Frank, and his privacy advocacy may have stemmed from the family's habit of secrecy. Secrecy. The Frankist doctrine of the did encourage infiltration and hiding within other religions' movements. Antinomianism. The Zionist revolt against the Galit diaspora did share the Frankist disdain for the ghetto Jew. However, the leap from these historical footnotes to a global conspiracy ignores the fundamental anti-Zionism of Jacob Frank himself, who rejected Palestine and the complex, varied origins of the Zionist movement. Conclusion. The unintended legacy. The relationship between Frankism and Israel is a study in unintended consequences. Jacob Frank, the man who wanted to erase Jerusalem from the Jewish heart and replace it with Poland, is now remembered by historians as the man who unwittingly helped clear the ground for the modern return to Zion. Frankism was a movement of the abyss. It sought to find God in the darkness, to redeem the world through violation. Its direct legacy, the baptized families of Poland and the Czech lands, eventually dissolved into the general population. But its indirect legacy, as mapped by Scholem, was the shattering of the absolute authority of the past. By declaring that the law of the creation was dead, Jacob Frank opened the door to a world where Jews could define themselves by something other than halakha. He did not build the state of Israel, he would have likely hated it for its geographic location. But in his nihilistic fury, he helped create the modern Jewish subject, fractured, rebellious, and capable of taking history into their own hands. The Frankist shadow over Israel is not one of control or conspiracy, but of a shared, traumatic origin in the rupture of the modern world. Data Appendix. Key events in Frankist history. Year, event, significance. 1726 Birth of Jacob Frank in Korolauka. Beginning of the Third Messiah era. 1755 Frank returns to Poland from Ottoman Empire. Activation of Sabbatian cells in Podolia. 1756 Lankoran incident. Exposure of sexual rituals, Rabbinic harem ban. 1757 Kamianic disputation. Frankists ally with church, burning of the Talmud. 1759 Elwau disputation. Frankists endorse the blood libel. 1759 mass baptism. 3,000 Frankists convert to Catholicism. 1760 Frank imprisoned in Czestochowa. 13-year incarceration. Development of Maiden theology. 1773 Frank released by Russians, moves to Brno. Establishment of the court. 1791 Death of Jacob Frank in Offenbach. Succession of Eva Frank Gvira. 1816 Death of Eva Frank. Decline of the organized sect. 1936 Gershom Scholem publishes Redemption Through Sin. Theoretical link between Frankism and Zionism established. Pipe.